This conference will now be recorded.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Volunteer Florida's AmeriCorps Standard Contract for the contract year 2018-2019. We're so glad you've joined the call today. Thank you for muting your lines. The call will be recorded and posted on our website for future access in case you need to share the content with anyone else on your team. My name is Kat Keene. I serve as the National Service Programs Director here at Volunteer Florida. And I'm joined by our finance team, Tracy Lambright, Senior Financial Analyst, Rochelle Johnson, Financial Analyst, and our Chief Financial Officer, Erin Scherstrom. In addition, Lizzie Winchester is our Grants and Training Coordinator, also leading our webinar. So welcome, everyone. I want to give you a couple pieces of overview as we start our AmeriCorps year together. First, just quickly, Volunteer Florida is the lead agency in Florida for the volunteerism and national service. We administer more than $32 million in federal, state, and local funding to deliver high-impact national service and volunteer programs here in Florida. We're also the state's lead for volunteers and donations before, during, and after disaster. I want to welcome you to the world of AmeriCorps. As you know, AmeriCorps is a national network of service programs engaging over 80,000 people annually. Members, your members, are going to commit their time to address critical issues in your community, like mentoring youth, sustaining national parks, preparing for disaster, and more. This year, you're part of Volunteer Florida's AmeriCorps family, and that's 38 AmeriCorps programs and over 1,400 members, who, when they complete their year of service, will earn $6.8 million in scholarships. AmeriCorps members make a tremendous impact in Florida. For example, just in the last year that we have full data, our almost 1,400 members served 1.67 million hours in 358 schools. Over almost 55,000 students were served in Florida. And most of those students, about 70%, had significant gains in academic improvement. And that's just one tiny data point that I want to share with you as I welcome you to really an amazing experience, which is AmeriCorps. So today, we're going to move through your contract package. We're going to talk about your standard contract, and we're going to talk about every exhibit that you receive via the Blackbaud grant-making system. We'll pause for questions at the end of each exhibit that we review. Next slide. This is your contract package. It includes your contract provisions, which is Exhibit 1, Exhibit 2, which is your proposal, a budget and narrative that you submitted via the e-grant system and was approved, the criminal history check status form, Exhibit 3, Exhibit 4, the general and AmeriCorps grant terms and conditions, Exhibit 5, a budget revision request, Exhibit 6, contract amendment, Exhibit 7, your monthly Volunteer Florida invoice worksheet, and Exhibit 8, property and inventory equipment list, Exhibit 9, contract checklist, Exhibit 10, vendor EFT authorization form, Exhibit 11, W9, and Exhibit 12, your contract closeout checklist. We want to make sure you understand each of these exhibits and how you'll use them to manage your contract year. So the first one we're going to talk about is Exhibit 1. Well, actually, the first one we'll show you is your contract. So your contract has primarily two sections, the terms and conditions, and some things to highlight include your overall end date, your allocation, deductions, withholdings, and payment, and then other provisions, which we'll talk about related to point of contact and contract exhibits. A sample of your contract is what we'll show you next. So when we talk about the AmeriCorps contract agreement, this is what it looks like. You'll see a start date of August 1st. You'll see your lead agency. And if we can scroll down in the document, the things to pay close attention to, under contract allocations, you'll see B1 is your total contract amount. That'll be a large number that will be made up of your CNCS share, B2, the federal portion, B3, the total grantee share. And under contract deductions and withholding is where you'll see two things. One is the commission's fixed fee for administrative costs. That's the 2% in your budget. And the second, again, is to reiterate your match amount. That is the match amount you included in your budget that you are contractually obligated to fulfill. If we can continue to scroll down. You'll also see, and you can keep scrolling, Lizzie, some information on funding and on invoicing. We will talk about our invoicing process a bit later. You'll see information on our finance department and where to send information. We'll also be talking about contract amendments, standard termination language, and then in other provisions, you'll see some language on sharing of products and your point of contact. You'll notice there's an AmeriCorps program manager listed, and you each have a program manager associated with contract management. And in essence, that is a program officer or grant officer, and they're your lead staff person here at Volunteer Florida for your contracting needs. The final section is the contract exhibits, and we'll be moving through all of those as well. This, if you can continue to scroll down just a bit more, this is the document that you will print off, that you'll include your contact information, your fiscal contact, the physical address with which the records are maintained, and this is also the document that your agency leadership will execute. They will sign. You will return this document to Volunteer Florida via the Blackbaud system. Our CEO will also sign, and then we will upload that final contract to you via the Blackbaud system. So this is the only document, when we say the contracts are due on August 15th, this is the document that should be signed and due on that date. So that's a little bit about the contract in itself. It's a brief document. The majority of items are going to be included in the additional exhibits. So before I move forward with those pieces, any questions about the actual contract? And you can include those ideally via phone or in the chat box. We just opened the line in case there's any questions. Okay, well, we're going to keep going, and you'll have plenty of opportunities to ask your questions throughout the webinar. Thank you. So Exhibit 1 is the provisions of your contract. There's two primary sections, provider agreements and commission agreements, and we will look at that together now. Okay, Exhibit 1, contract provisions. There's a lot of information in here. I want to make sure that you review it all. Lizzie's going to scroll through, and I'm going to give you some high-level comments. Be aware that these funds are governed by the Corporation for National Community Service and the National Community Trust Act, as well as state and other federal laws. There's a mention of AmeriCorps state and national grants and general grant terms and conditions. That's a separate document, exhibit. We'll go through that soon. But those would be the federal guidelines for this grant. And you can keep going. So here you'll see a mention of the exhibits that we're going to talk about together. So it reiterates the importance of those exhibits. Program name, this is your AmeriCorps program name. You'll be deciding one if you haven't already. That will be the name of your program. Program performance measures and training, we're reiterating the need to have one FTE associated with the program, which should be included in your budget. You'll see, you can continue to scroll down, some AmeriCorps member recruitment responsibilities, including the member service agreement, and again, a reference to some of those AmeriCorps terms and conditions. AmeriCorps members are serving in service positions, and there is an enrollment process in the eGrants portal. And I'll pause here just to share with you, as many of you know, that has changed, and so now AmeriCorps members must be enrolled no more than 5 days from their start of service in the portal. We'll have some more technical assistance coming out soon on that, but that is a change from last year. You'll see that member positions can be revised, but that would be something that your program manager here at Volunteer Florida would work with you on if that was a need. You'll also see some language about the National Service Criminal History Check. That's a separate exhibit. We're going to get into that in just a moment. That is a key area to pay attention to in grants management, as this is the area that we see most cost disallowance associated. And there is a need to perform through that 3-part criminal history check on all members and staff associated with either the federal or the match sections of your grant. We'll talk about that a bit later. There's an end of term and exit form that must be completed on all members, and some requirements related to exiting in the portal. Staff training, you'll get a lot of training from your Volunteer Florida team. There's information coming out soon on our programmatic and fiscal training that will be held this fall. We have a second multi-day face-to-face training in the spring, so you'll receive quite a bit of training from our team. Related to member training, there are 5 different member trainings that Volunteer Florida requires that programs provide their members, and we can give you some assistance on that as well. We see most of those member trainings occurring during the kind of pre-training, readying members for service, but they can also happen throughout the year. Budget. I'd like to invite Tracy Lambright, our Senior Financial Analyst, to give you some budget information. Tracy?
And good afternoon. Moving on with the budget. The budget, of course, is in eGrants. It has been approved, so you'll need to be sure that you go there to get that corrected version, just in case you guys went through some corrections. Please note that there are match requirements. Those match requirements can be cash or in kind. And we are going to allow budget revisions if you go over 10% of your line item. So we can start looking at those once your programs start beginning. If you find that you need to move around a little bit of the funds to cover some of your expenses, you'll have opportunities to do that, and we'll go further into the presentation. If we move down through property. Property is referring to any equipment that you purchase using federal funds. You would have already put some of this into your budgets if that was something that you are wanting to do. If you have not and you find a need for your program, that is something that you'll need to contact your program manager and get the commission's approval for before moving forward with any of those type of purchases.
Thanks, Tracy. So budget revisions are something that you may need this year, and we'll work with you through that process. You won't need to submit a budget revision for every change. Again, Tracy mentioned that 10%. Typically, this happens if you are reconfiguring slots or potentially not expending those member support dollars. So moving on to program planning and reporting, you'll report to Volunteer Florida in a first quarter format and then a mid-year and end-of-year format primarily. The Disability Community Development Plan is an end-of-year requirement, and that's a plan where you would be connecting to other inclusion organizations to support inclusion efforts for AmeriCorps. Sustainability plan is also important, though not due until you're recompeting for funds after your 3rd year. Now moving to other reports, and this is important. This is a contract requirement that 1 program representative and 1 fiscal representative complete both the fiscal online training and the National Criminal History Check online training. What's new this year is that link for CNCS online courses, Litmus, self-sign-up. That's a new link that's provided nationally this year. You'll complete those trainings and you'll upload the certificate to our Blackbaud grants management system, and that will document that you've completed that grant requirement. We find that it's really key that both somebody from your fiscal team and your grant or program team complete both of these, because we've learned, and many of you will understand the comments, those are two sides of your team that must work in hand to make these grants successful. And it will also review in detail some of those federal requirements with funds, as well as the requirements for the criminal history check and cost disallowance. And our team will follow up by providing face-to-face, hands-on training on these topics at our fall convening.
Moving on to financial reports for reimbursement. You all received as part of your exhibits the monthly invoice form that we will talk about a little bit later. But to go over, you will submit that form along with any of your expenses by the 15th of each month. One invoice is due, the first invoice is due 45 days after the program starts. So your first invoice after the program starts August 1st, your first invoice for the month of August expenses will be due to us on September the 14th. And then every invoice after that is due by the 15th of the month. If you run into some type of delay or other circumstance that has occurred that allows you to not be able to get that to us, please contact us by email or contact your program manager, let them know and request an extension. Just keep in contact with us. You know, we can work with you on that. Each month, supporting documentation for all of your expenditures is going to be required to be turned in with your invoice. Because this is a cost reimbursement contract, the expenditures that you will claim on each monthly invoice would have to have been paid for within the month in which you're claiming them. So, for example, for the month of August, that first invoice, anything that you've paid for the program that were paid for expenses in the month of August would go on an August invoice. If you have an August payroll that you've paid in the month of September, so say your August 25th payroll end date doesn't get paid until September the 2nd, that becomes a September expense and would be expended on your September invoice. There are final financial reports and reimbursement and closeout checklists at the end of the contract year. There is a final July invoice, which is the 12th invoice for the program. Then there is a final report that is due 45 days after that if you need to recoup any of those expenditures that you were not able to seek reimbursement for throughout the year, or to cover any of that payroll that may have been paid in the month of August that ran through the end of the program year through July 31st. You'll have an opportunity to turn in a final report no later than September the 14th, 2019. And we'll go further into the monthly reimbursement form that is required. Those invoices are due to us by the 15th again and will be sent to a PER mailbox. PER stands for Periodic Expenditure Report, and that address is per@volunteerflorida.org. All correspondence regarding to the invoice and supporting documentation should be sent to that address.
Thanks, Tracy. Many of you won't have very full cost to invoice for August, but I'd encourage you to start the process and to invoice. Of course, you may be invoicing on things like staff time and background check and minimal member costs, but it's important that you invoice on time and fully. You'll get some more hands-on training from us, but starting that process and not delaying it is an important part of your grant success this year. Keep going. Okay, we talk about partnership development and site agreements. These are typically with your schools or your other service sites. There's some guidance for that as well. Keep scrolling. Disaster preparedness and mitigation. You see a lot of language in here, and a lot of this is FEMA related or related to an official declared disaster. So we include that information here, as well as we often have had members engaged in disaster response, but there is a process for that. Okay, we talked about technical assistance. All programs are required to engage in at least one day of service, one of the days of national service, things like September 9/11, MLK Day. We usually see a lot of movement on those days around the state. Quality assurance and evaluation. This language is around tracking the success of your program and continuous improvement activities. And also you'll note a stakeholder survey as part of this. That is a stakeholder survey that you would put out in the field, engaging feedback from your stakeholders. Records and documentation, and this is an important period of 6 years. So that is the time, 6 years after the termination of the provider agreement, in which you are retaining via audit all key documents, audit findings, communication, and other documents associated with managing the grant. You'll see some language on safeguarding information and Florida statutes, and information on indemnification and subcontracts. Insurance, that is a requirement. Adequate liability, workers' comp, fidelity, property, vehicle insurance. Not all of these may be related to your AmeriCorps member service. For example, vehicle insurance is applicable if your members are driving company vehicles. For many, that's not required, but you'll see that the insurance is a grant requirement coming up as an initial grant requirement. We'll talk about that in a bit. Sponsorship, and this is key. You'll want to think about how you engage in tri-branding for your program. And when I say tri-branding, I mean the AmeriCorps Florida logo, the Volunteer Florida logo, and your organization's logo. That's what we call the powerful tri-brand of AmeriCorps in Florida. But what you'll see here is some language on how you should refer to Volunteer Florida and the Corporation for National and Community Service in key communications to stakeholders, press releases, documents, etc. And we included for you a statement on Volunteer Florida, and that's under Sponsorship 3A that can be included. As Tracy mentioned, these are reimbursable contracts, so that's mentioned here as well. And then I'll just mention our site visits for continuous improvement. Our team is typically doing an annual site visit or desk audit each and every year for every program. This is a one-year contract, and organizations are typically funded through a 3-year period in the AmeriCorps model, but these deliverables and these contracts are associated with a 1-year term. Okay, and that is the review of the contract, where you noted many references to the exhibits, and that's the next section of our webinar. We'll move into exhibits. And then before we do, let's open the lines and see if there's any key questions that you have via the phone or chat for the contract. Okay.
Hello?
We'll move on then to Exhibit 2. Now, I think every exhibit is important. Just like I think every program is my favorite, but Exhibit 2 is your approved proposal, your budget, and your budget narrative. This is what you said you were going to do. So this is your eGrants application. It's the foundation of your program year. We're not going to pull this document up to review because that is very individualized, but this represents your final application. It represents what you were funded to do. So please be very familiar with the content. Be familiar with any clarification that you made based on Volunteer Florida feedback. Be very clear on what your budget states, especially related to match. Be clear on your performance measures, what you said you were going to measure, how, in what way, and with what frequency. This is your funded activities for the year. So if you have staff that are managing the grant that did not write the grant, please make sure they read this, that they read that grant. This is your finance team, your programmatic team, your new hires. This is what we would expect to see in this contract year. So please do share this with anyone on your team that needs to become familiar with what they're under contract to deliver. This is the key foundation of your year. Now, this is what I would say is everyone's favorite exhibit, the National Service Criminal History Check status form. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this, and then we're going to move into actually looking at the form. For those of you that have been with Volunteer Florida, we have updated this form, and it is much more user-friendly. And our team is just flat out excited about it this year. So I'll share with you first, this is something that is due October 31st, so it's due about 90 days from your contract start. This is an area where there will be cost disallowance if programs do not complete this 3-part criminal history check in accordance to CNCS rules, so we want to avoid that. NSOPW stands for National Sex Offender Predator Website. Now, this is the link you'll see in just a moment, but this must be completed on all members and staff prior to work or service hours, including training. So that means if you are thinking about hiring anyone as a staff member or as an AmeriCorps member, you want to run this NSOPW. It is a name-based check. It would take about 1 minute to complete, and that is something you'd probably want to do even if you were considering a hire. You'll want to make sure when you run the check that all states are included, all states and territories, and that if you have any what we call hits, which would be a person, say you're running a person's name that is a common name, and there are many people that come up with that name, you want to certify an initial besides every one of those individuals that that is not the staff person or the AmeriCorps member. And you'll want to sign and date that. We'll be providing you a bit more training on that face-to-face, and then you also have the training, the CNCS National Service Criminal History Check training that you'll be taking as part of your contract. I want to also mention that the FBI and state of residency checks must be initiated, members and staff, prior to the start of work or service. And what initiated means is one step beyond that staff or AmeriCorps member giving their consent to do the criminal history check. So what initiation looks like for each program may be different, and you'll include that as you draft policies for your criminal history check procedures. So now let's move into the Exhibit 3 and take a look. So first, let's start with the FAQ tab. Let's just get right to the frequently asked questions. Now what you'll see here is the steps to verify, steps to complete the National Service Criminal History Check. You want to make sure that your policies include all of those steps that you're taking for your members and your staff. And then all the way to the right of the screen, you'll see quick links. This is where you'll find that NSOPW site. That's where you'll find the state repository for Florida, which is the Florida Department FDLE. You'll find information on FieldPrint, which is the CNCS designated vendor for FBI checks. So this is your one-stop shop for quick links and for FAQs related to how to complete Exhibit 3 and how to document that you've completed. You can scroll over a little bit the other way. Yeah, if we could, how you'll complete really some of the nuances. You know, you'll want to have written authorization from the person. You'll keep records for that, and you'll verify that the check has occurred, etc. So now let's move into the staff. Let's move into staff. So everyone has staff that are charged to this grant. So you'll see here under on this section, you'll include the staff's last name. You'll always include last name first, and then moving through their position, their hire date, when the completion date occurred for their NSOPW, and the initiation and completion date of the state of residency and the FBI fingerprint check. If The cell turns red, that will note in compliance. That will mean that is a non-compliant check and cost disallowance will result. And why that cell would turn red is if their hire date, if the person started to serve or work before the NSOPW was completed or before the state of residency or FBI checks were initiated. And if you're completing this correctly, if you see red, that would indicate cost disallowance, and we would move forward with that process. If we can move to the Member tab, this is where you'll input the same information for your AmeriCorps members. We've made this exhibit due 3 months into your contract year because by that time you will have enrolled most members, maybe perhaps not all, but most. And then we'll have a process for reviewing this again near the end of your contract year. Again, please refer to the FAQs for this process. Some of this information has been updated from year to year, so you'll always want to make sure that you review each contract document every year for those changes. So I think we'll pause there because we did review 2 documents, and we'll see if anyone has any questions in the chat or the phone line. We see one question related to late payment in the chat box. Tracy?
Pardon me. So for late submission, says for late submissions of reimbursements, is payment withheld or delayed? Of course, it's going to be delayed because with those invoices that are actually turned in time and provide all the supporting documentation by contract, we have 45 days to review that. So if you do not make it in by that date, it just pushes that 45-day clock forward by how many days that you have turned in that submission. So no, it won't be withheld necessarily. It'll just be delayed within that period. Also note that if a invoice comes in without proper supporting documentation, that can also cause a delay in receiving payment, as we will reach out to you requesting that documentation. Give you a certain amount of days to get that information back to us. And if that is not done, then we will remove it from the invoice, move ahead with payment of those that we can go ahead and pay, and then you can claim those expenses at a later date once that documentation is, you're able to provide that documentation.
Tracy, any other questions? All right. So I see another question about team members began working prior to the grant. And so the question says, AmeriCorps members began working on the grant in May and did the background checks in July. Oh, they were hired in May and did the background checks in July. At first glance, that seems problematic because it seems like it's indicating that background checks were done in July, but then members started serving in May. If indeed those members started serving in May versus hired, that would be problematic. If members were, for example, executed contracts but did not serve or work or were not in training until their background checks were complete, that would be okay. And whoever shared that question, just contact the program manager and you can talk about that offline. One other thing I'll note with the National Service Criminal History, self-reported disallowance is preferable. There's a decreased cost associated with self-reported. So if that does occur and you know it's occurred, go ahead and share that with us, and the disallowance in the matrix will be less. And we'll share that information with you via CNCS as well. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And this question has to do with what is the time frame in which organizations will be notified that there is insufficient documentation backup for the PER? Is that 45 days as well?
Yes, it's for the contract. Have 45 days to review and get out payments on invoices that provide everything. So the 45-day period does also apply to the review period and getting those emails out on insufficient documentation.
Thanks, Saul. Thanks, Tracy. We'll pause questions for now. We'll move to our next exhibit, which will be Exhibit 4, and then we'll take some more questions in just a moment. So Exhibit 4 is made up of 2 documents, and that is the 2018 General Grant Terms and Conditions and the 2018 AmeriCorps Terms and Conditions. So be familiar with this document. It updates annually. So the language in this does change year to year for those of you that have been a grantee for a number of years. And you'll see key information in here related to requirements like healthcare coverage, prohibited activities, member service agreements. And now what we're going to do is some scrolling. We're going to look at this document, and we're going to look at what's new under the General Grant Terms and Conditions. And then we're going to look at what's new under the AmeriCorps Terms and Conditions. And so if we can scroll down a little bit, you'll see this is how the document starts. And changes are going to be right here. Okay, so this is the changes. It's right in the beginning of the general terms and conditions. And there's nothing too significant here, but there is an added requirement related to the annual National Service Criminal History Check compliance training. And there's a couple other updates too. So you should read and reference this within the document. And then we'll move down to the AmeriCorps Terms and Conditions, which is probably about halfway through. And under AmeriCorps Terms and Conditions, you know, these do change more regularly, and those changes this year at least are more significant. So we want to highlight those for you as well. And we're almost there. But as you can see, important to read and share with your grant team. So as we enter the AmeriCorps Terms and Conditions, we'll scroll down to what's changed as well in this document. And you can pause there. It's right in the beginning under changes from the previous year. And you can see there's quite a number of things. So please pay attention to this. I'll say that one of the most significant things that's been added is that pre-enrollment piece and that 5-day. So that is probably the most significant one, but please be aware of that. There's also some additional language for the 3/4 time position, which some of you have requested this year. Evaluation plan and learning memo, you've seen this in your grants this year, but it's codified here. And that those e-courses that we mentioned in the contract, there's some more language here about how you'll access those. So those are key things to pay attention to in that exhibit. So I think we'll move actually into the budget revision request, and then we'll pause again for questions so that we can cover the content today. And this form is also very important to your program, as you will likely request budget revisions. Tracy.
Yeah. So I just want to start by reiterating the fact that, you know, the budget is a working document, and you should always be familiar with your budget. You'll need to be using this to compare your actual expenditures on a monthly basis, and you should be sharing this with your program staff as well as your finance staff so that everyone understands where you are, what is allowable, and what is not allowable under the grant. You will need to be comparing both your expenditures and your match, as there is a required match with this grant, as we mentioned when we were going over the provisions. We cannot stress enough just about how important it is for all program and finance staff to be familiar with the budget and to use this as a working document that you will review on a monthly basis. This will help you foresee any issues that may arise and help you see if you need to move funds around within your budget so that you can get the best use out of your funds, and so you have an opportunity to maximize them. So if you find, you may run into where you find that you want to do a budget revision, you know, to better maximize the funds and your program. So the budget revision form is in Excel, and the formulas are built in for you. Lizzie's going to pull the form up for us. So for you returning programs, I mean, it's the same form. Please remember that there are formulas built in there for you. So it will calculate everything for you as long as you don't enter anything in those blocks. Once you enter your original budget number and input your increases and decreases, the revised budget section will automatically populate. So as you note, there are 3 columns: the original budget column, the budget changes column, and the revised budget columns. In the original budget section, the numbers should be the approved budget numbers from your budget and eGrants. So for your first revision, you'll be sure to go to eGrants and use the budget numbers that are provided in there, as that is your approved budget. In the budget changes columns, this is where you'll note any increases and decreases that you're wanting to make that would be added. You will also need to be sure that all the way to the right-hand side, there are columns that allow for a justification as to why you're trying to move the funds. Please note that this section should total 0 at the bottom totals. You should be increasing your funds in one area and decreasing them in another, just moving the monies around. When you do a budget revision, your bottom line budget numbers should never change. Your CNCS funds and your match funds should remain the same in the revised budget column as they were in the original budget column. When you need to do a second budget revision, your new original budget will come from your first budget revision, the revised budget columns. That will now become your original budget. So when you start to fill out your second revision, those numbers will actually go in original budget. You'll make your increases and decrease, and then the revised budget columns will calculate for you, and that will now be your original budget. Please note that we allow 4 budget revisions within a year, so you'll want to use them wisely. The deadline for the last budget revision will be that it must be submitted and received by Volunteer Florida by your program manager no later than April 1st.
Thank you, Tracy. And I'll just share that when you're doing your first budget revision, this usually has to do with member cost, slot conversion, things like that. And when you're doing your last budget revision, it usually has to do with end-of-year expenditures. It's important because, you know, we look at success, not just the success of the beneficiaries that you serve and success about the transformational AmeriCorps experience, but success is also fully utilizing your federal funds and your match. These dollars were allocated to you in your program to do this work, and we want you to fully expend all of these funds. That is why we allow budget revisions those 4 times this year. And your program manager will be your point person for any of those questions. Thank you, Tracy. You're welcome. Well, let's pause here to see if anyone has any questions related to the budget revision or related to the AmeriCorps and grant petitions. We'll open the chat and the phone line. Okay, so we'll then move on to Exhibit 6, which is going to be our contract amendment form. Tracy? Okay. So we use the contract amendment form for any request where you want to change your contracted CNCS funding or your match requirement. If for any reason that you're wanting to increase or decrease that, you will of course need to contact the commission, your program manager, and then this form would be submitted through CNCS to try to get an approval for that. We do not recommend them, and they're very, very rare. So if you do need to do that, please contact your program managers. This form will need to be completed. You'll need to make a request using the budget revision form as well to let us know what you're proposing as your new budget. You'll submit this along with the form. Volunteer Florida will take the lead in completing it and submit it to CNCS for approval. There will be some time involved in this process, so you want to keep this in mind if you're thinking that this might be an option for you. Great. Great, thank you, Tracy. And that's a quick picture of what that contract amendment would look like. All right. So moving into our next exhibit, Exhibit 7, is the Volunteer Florida Monthly Invoice Worksheet. Another favorite exhibit, an important exhibit.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And you will probably hear us refer to this as the PER. As I'd mentioned earlier, we call it a PER. It's a periodic expenditure report. So if you hear that, you know that we're talking about the Volunteer Monthly Invoice Worksheet. This invoice worksheet should be sent in with every monthly invoice request for reimbursement. The first PER is due to us 45 days after the start of the contract year. And each month thereafter, the invoice is then due on the 15th of each month. Please be sure that you have signed and dated the monthly invoice before sending it to us, because that is required. And yes, we will take an electronic signature and date. On this form, Lizzie's pulled up for us, everybody can see. I need it to be filled in to have your lead agency name, your program name. The invoice date should be for the month you're submitting. So if you're submitting your August invoice, the invoice dates would be August 1st to August 31st. If you're doing September, it's September 1 to September 30th. And of course, the program year is the 18-19 program year. The CNCS columns are actually the columns in which you will request your reimbursable expenses. The grantee columns is where you are reporting your match expenditures. So your CNCS columns, whatever is the total, that is the amount that will be reimbursed to you. Providing all supporting documentation that was required was included. Please note that upon receiving the first invoice, you must have also had other requirements completed as required by the program side regarding the contract checklist and all of those documents. And also note that the same requirements that apply for the CNCS share also apply to the grantee share. So whatever documents that we would require for CNCS reimbursable expenses are the same documents that we will require for the grantee share. You will submit a PDF of the signed invoice as well as the Excel version. This will help us in reviewing the invoice. Sometimes it becomes difficult to read if you print it out, sign it, and PDF it. So if that's what you want to do, we'd also like you to send us the Excel version without the signature. That way we're able to see the numbers so that we don't do under or overpayments.
All right.
Oh, I wanted to note one other thing. Lizzie, could you scroll down to the bottom of the form where the tabs are? This year, in the past, we had used things called cover sheets, and several of you expressed in the past that you had wanted to use these, and they are actually very beneficial for the finance team here at Volunteer Florida in following your invoice, trying to make sure, when we're trying to verify calculations. So at the bottom, there is a tab called Sample Cover Sheets. And all they are is quick little Excel verbs where you can just kind of tell us, in personnel, who did you include and how you came up with your calculations and your splits. Using these cover sheets and putting them ahead in the beginning of all of your documentation, it allows us, like I said, to better review the documents and to better review your calculations. They're very beneficial, so if you could use those, we would really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tracy. So we'll move on to the next one, Property and Equipment Inventory, Exhibit 8, and then we'll take some questions. And for those of you on the phone, we are in the final stretch of the AmeriCorps contract webinar. So property and inventory, Tracy.
So property and inventory the property and inventory form is a cumulative list of all property, regardless of the purchase date, that has a purchase price of $500 or more that you purchased using these federal funds through your contract with the commission. This would include anything like computers, desktops, laptops, iPads, specialty software, regardless of your acquisition cost or value. If it is in your budget and you've been approved to purchase it, and it is to benefit the AmeriCorps program, and it should be purchased early on in the program year. Please remember that the personal cost of property is higher than $500. It must be recorded on this property and equipment inventory form that will be filed at the end of your contract year, along with all your contract closeout checklist documentation. Also note that if it's not in your budget, but you think that it would be beneficial for your program, you can always do a budget revision request and contact your program manager to try to get prior approval from the commission to purchase the property if we deem that it is necessary for your program.
Thanks, Tracy. So we will open the lines in the phone in the chat to see if you have any questions about the monthly invoice, Exhibit 7, Exhibit 8, or Exhibit 6. Any questions on the last 3 exhibits?
Ted, it's Steve, Bulk Reed.
Hi, Steve. What's your question?
Question for Tracy on those cover sheets.
Yes.
So currently, mine come in on paper, and they're in between each section. Is that cover sheet just followed behind the worksheet, or how would it be presented to you?
In front of each section. So if you have, if you've got personnel expenses, then you would have your PER form, your cover sheet, and then all your supporting documentation. And then the next section would be personnel fringe, staff travel. It'd be placed in front of each section.
All right, thanks.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Steve. Let's see, a question in the chat box. Do we need to provide an inventory for property purchase out of the grantee share? And I'll share that the property and equipment inventory is to be sent in at the end of the year. It's not until the end of the year that that's needed. And really it depends on where you budgeted that material. You might have budgeted that in your grantee share or in your CMCS share, and then it would be associated with where you budgeted it. Any other questions on the line? Okay, I see a question on how are funds dispersed. Tracy, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so funds are dispersed by ACH. One of your exhibits is the EFT form, which I think is just a couple more slides away. That gives us authorization to automatically direct deposit the funds into your bank once we're ready to make payments. So as long as you have that form on file with us, we will send those ACH directly. If you do not have that file and form with us, then of course a check will be issued, and then it is mailed through the U.S. Postal Service.
I see a question. Who needs to sign the PER form? The person submitting the invoice? Yes, that's correct.
Yes.
Another question, such as 50% at contract execution. I'm not sure what this question means, but this is a cost reimbursement contract, so the contract is expended per the invoicing process. And invoices might look different each month depending on the cost of the grant. The individual that asked that question, you can certainly clarify with us offline, and we can get you a more thorough answer if needed. Any other questions?
Kat, this is Carla with AmeriCorps Miami Reads. I have a questioning in reference to hi, how are you guys?
Good.
In reference to the service side agreement. So with the service side agreement, we do an affiliated agreement with the school district. All the principals sign off on that agreement, and it's just one agreement, but then it takes a while for the district to actually sign off and get that agreement back to us. So is it okay if I upload the side agreement that I have where the principals have signed off on it? It's not the district representative signature won't be there, but at least all the principals of the schools that we're serving signature will be there.
Yeah, great question, Carla. Thank you for that. And Carla's sharing kind of a perspective many of you may have where you have both a district agreement and then you have individual site agreements with the schools or service sites. And yeah, Carla, you can work with your program manager on that, and that is something that we're familiar with. with the timeline it takes for a district to execute, and then the more immediacy of being able to execute it with principals. So yes, that's fine. You can work with your program manager on that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or in the chat box? All right, well, we're going to move to a really important exhibit, which is Exhibit 9, the contract checklist. So everyone, you received your contract via email. You received a link, and in that link, there's lots of reminders, and they are reflected here on Exhibit 9, the contract checklist. This is a review of really what's needed in the first 3 months of your contract. And so to review, that is your executed contract on the 15th. It is your vendor EFT authorization form, the electronic funds transfer form, and the W-9, which we're going to talk about. As applicable, copies of insurance policies as listed, and your most recent audit statement if not previously provided. Some of you have provided your audit statements associated with the grant, but some of those were not current. They may have been for the last year that you had an audit, which by this point would be quite a long time ago. So we want to have your most recent audit statement. The AmeriCorps program startup documents, you've been in conversation with your program manager on those documents. And then you see those 2 trainings that we mentioned, the financial and grants management and the criminal history check online trainings. And October 31st is when your National Service Criminal History Check Exhibit 3 and support documents are due. Why Exhibit 9 exists is so there is a single place with which you can execute done, done, done. You know, all of these things are done, Volunteer Florida, and send that in to us. So this is really for your use to kind of check off that you have met all of these requirements. And then when you have met them, October 31st, you'll sign this and upload it into the Blackbaud system. So it's really a checklist for you in the beginning of the year, and then we have a final checklist at the end of the year for your use. So both for your use and for ours in managing grant requirements. And let's see, yeah, let's pull that up. No, that's the closeout. Oh, sorry. There we go. So it looks like this checklist. So you'll see this is something where you will initial, and sign, much like the slide, if we can scroll to the bottom. And you're certifying, yes, this has been provided, and then you'll upload this by October 31st. You'll also see note of this policy for breaches of personally identified information, PII. This was a requirement last year, and so it's also included this year, that organizations have procedures in place to prepare for and respond to. And then you'll sign and upload that. Okay, let's move to the next exhibit. All right, so quickly, we're almost there, everybody. We're almost to the finish line. Tracy, do you want to talk about these exhibits?
Sure. W-9 and EFT forms, they are required. Finance has to have them on file for us to issue payments to you. So if you've not already done so and gotten those into us, please do those quickly. Like I said, the vendor EFT form allows us to electronically deposit your reimbursements directly into your bank account. And if we don't have those on file, we have to send them through U.S. Postal Service. So this allows for a quicker delivery. And of course, W-9, we have to have that on file for all vendors that we pay. So please be sure that those forms are into us.
Great, thank you, Tracy. And as you can see, both are fillable. So that should be help you. And please also make sure your routing number and your other numbers associated with your EFT form are correct. And if they have changed, please update that form.
Correct and readable.
Correct and readable.
If you're going to handwrite them, please be sure that the numbers are legible.
Thank you. All right. So any questions about these forms? We'll open up the lines, these forms, or the contract checklist. It looks like one individual has a question about the due dates of the CNCS trainings. They would be 914. You may notice a discrepancy, but 914 is when they're due. And really, what we need to do is receive these from you when we're issuing reimbursement. So if you get done these trainings and submit them earlier, that is absolutely fine. All right, so we'll open up the lines and see if there's any other questions on the call. Okay, so moving on to Exhibit 12, the contract closeout checklist. This is really for your end of the year, for another checklist for you when you're closing out your year. And this is all information that you'll be certifying, including member exits, data, completion of the Volunteer Florida annual survey, and final expenses. And if we can pull that up real quick. So it's going to look very similar to the initial contract checklist, but you'll be checking off and certifying that all of these things have happened with the close of your contract year. Some of these things might not be familiar to you now, but they will be as you attend training and move through managing of your members. This is basically a certification that all of the key grant activities have occurred. It also notes where records are going to be kept and that they're going to be kept on file for the audit period mentioned, which was 6 years after the close of the contract. We have one last slide for you today that we want to show you, which is some language on how to find your contract. You received the link to the Blackbaud system, and that Blackbaud grant making is a system that Volunteer Florida uses to manage grant requirements. We've provided a tutorial for you. If you are not the person that is accessing your contract package or fulfilling grant requirements, this tutorial will help any user be able to walk through those steps, and it's a YouTube video featured here. Our tips are that you do use Microsoft Explorer or Mozilla Foxfire as browsers to access Blackbaud, our system. And within the system, there has been granted access to one individual, and you have your password. The system only allows one person per each organization to have access. So if your key user changes, you would need to let us know. So that is your tutorial on how to access your contract. The next link you see says AmeriCorps contract, and again, that is the link for you to bookmark. That is the Blackbaud Grants Management System. So, and could you click that one real quick, Lizzie? So that is what your login will look like when you are engaging in all of these activities. You will sign in, you will have your password, and then you'll move through all of the documents. Some things that we love about the system is that there's date and time stamps, there's emails that you will receive and that we can receive, and all requirements have dates and associated documentation. So it's a way both for you and for us to manage all of those AmeriCorps pieces. Thank you. And when you are in the system, just note you'll look under Requirements tab. They're not Application tab because you didn't apply in the system. Only Requirement tab. So for those of you on the line today, we hope that this has been helpful. If you have other team members that will be utilizing or working with us or utilizing any of these platforms, know that this will be recorded and posted, and we'll send out that link later that you can share with your teams. We wanted to provide a broad and deep look for you with all of the exhibits so that this information was centralized so that your year can be as smooth as possible. And I want to thank you in advance. Our team knows the tremendous impact of AmeriCorps. We're so inspired by the AmeriCorps members whose lives are changed and the students and the others that AmeriCorps members serve. It is absolutely motivating and inspiring to us, and we're so excited to work with you. We know that their success depends on your success. And so our team is here for you throughout the year. So please do contact us with any questions. And with that, I think we'll close the webinar and have a great day, everyone.